Welcome back to the deep dive. We love taking topics that seem dense, maybe even a little boring on the surface,
hmm
and showing you the massive high-stakes system hiding underneath. And today we are tackling something that is arguably the most consequential long-term financial structure in your life, whether you're 25 or 65.
We're talking about pensions.
We are talking about pensions.
And it sounds like a simple topic, right? Money saved for retirement.
Yeah.
But it is anything but simple.
Not at all.
When we talk about a pension, we are examining this vast, multi-layered machine. It's built on promises, on deferred compensation, massive amounts of, well, actuarial guesswork,
Right.
and national risk management.
Yeah.
It really determines the financial stability of individuals and, entire nations.
Exactly. Our mission today is not to just give you the textbook definition of a 401k.
Well,
It's to cut through the jargon, the DBs, the DCs, the TYGO, and give you the foundational insight into who is holding the risk for your old age, and crucially, what happens when that system starts to break.
let's start with a swift clarification then. Fundamentally, a pension is a fund. It's designed to provide regular periodic payments to support you after you retire.
It's a long-term, continuous payment.
Yes.
And that's the crucial distinction you need to internalize. It is not severance pay.
right. That's a one-time thing.
It's a one-time fixed lump sum. It's paid out typically when you're, involuntarily terminated before retirement. Pensions are about a continuous financial flow designed to last your lifespan after retirement.
And you see this confusing array of names for it. Retirement plans in the U.S., pension schemes in the U.K., superannuation or super down in Australia. They all refer to this core contract.
And these plans can be set up by almost any entity, your employer, an insurance company, a labor union, or, critically, the government.
Which is what the U.S. Social Security system essentially is.
Exactly. And just a quick note on scope, a lot of these retirement plans aren't just about the retiree.
That's a good point.
They often include an insurance aspect, right, to make sure benefits are paid to survivors or disabled beneficiaries, which just adds another layer of complexity to the risk pool.
So to navigate this huge terrain, we're going to focus on structure and risk.
Okay.
We need to understand the fundamental split in retirement design, because your future security really hinges entirely on whether you are in a structure that guarantees the contribution or one that guarantees the payout.
And that brings us to the foundational distinction, the two foundational pillars of modern retirement funding, defined benefit versus defined contribution. We're going to start with what a lot of people think of as the retirement ideal, the kind of structure previous generations counted on for absolute security, the defined benefit or DB plan.
The structure is simple in its promise, but very complex in its delivery. In a DB plan, the benefit, the actual monthly payment you receive after retirement, is defined. It's set in advance by a formula.
So if I started working in, say, 1985, my HR department could tell me that my pension payment would be equal to, let's say, my years worked, multiplied by my final salary, multiplied by a specific accrual rate, maybe 1.5%. That promise is rock solid, right?
Well, the promise to the employee is solid, yes. And that is why the risk allocation is so crucial here.
Okay.
The firm, the sponsor, they bear all the investment risk. If the stock market crashes or the fund's investments underperform for a decade, the employer must make up the difference in contributions to meet that fixed promise.
That sounds incredibly stressful for the company. They are essentially writing an open-ended check based on, decades of speculation.
They are. The promise remains fixed. So if the fund does spectacularly well, the company still only pays the defined amount.
Right.
If it performs poorly, the company is on the hook. And this model has traditionally been run by huge, long-standing institutions, major businesses, or governments, precisely because they are assumed to have the stability and longevity to withstand those risks.
A major threat to any fixed payment over a, 30-year retirement period is inflation. How do these DB plans even begin to mitigate that?
They have to build an indexation. So, for example, in the UK, benefits are often indexed to inflation measures like the retail prices index. However, to control the company's liability, these increases are frequently capped. You might see a cap at, say, 3% or 5% in any given year.
So it maintains some value, but doesn't bankrupt the sponsor.
It ensures the benefit maintains some real value, exactly, without bankrupting the sponsor in a hyperinflationary environment.
Let's talk about early retirement. If a DB plan lets me retire before my scheduled age, my payments are almost always reduced. Why isn't that considered like a penalty for leaving early? Is it just simple math?
It is entirely simple actuarial math. It's not a penalty.
Okay.
If you retire 5 years early, you are expected to receive payments for 5 additional years. So that means the total present value of your benefits must be reduced so that the same pot of money covers a longer payout duration. The actuaries make sure the plan stays mathematically sound no matter when you start taking payments.
Speaking of complexity, let's get into the incredible administrative headaches these systems create, especially in the public sector. The outline mentions states like Alabama and California shifting to tiered systems. Explain what that means and why it creates such internal complexity.
This is a spectacular example of how political and financial pressure forces a rigid system to bend, but, it often breaks the internal solidarity.
How so?
Imagine a large city government. They hire an employee, let's call him Bob, in 1988. He's under Tier I rules, which might let him retire at age 55 with 75% of his final salary.
Yeah, great deal.
A great deal. Then financial reality hits, and the state legislature passes reforms in, say, 2012.
So Jane, who gets hired in 2014, she comes in under Tier 3.
Precisely. And Jane might not be able to retire with full benefits until age 65 or even 67, and she might only get 55% of her final average salary.
Wow.
So you have two employees doing the same job sitting side by side, but they're operating under drastically different financial contracts, defined only by their hire date.
That has to create massive administrative, legal, and political complexity within that single pension fund.
It's a nightmare.
So the DB model introduces these headaches for the government or the sponsor. But wait, we focused on the employee's security. The real reason DD plans vanished in the private sector is a problem of massive corporate liability.
That's the fundamental truth. The decline of the private DB plan since the 1980s wasn't about generosity. It was about cost uncertainty and this open-ended risk that executives just could not tolerate anymore.
How difficult is it really to calculate the cost of a DB plan? It sounds like it should be simple addition.
It's the furthest thing from simple. Figuring out the annual cost requires an actuary to use these highly sophisticated models based entirely on educated guesses.
Guesses about what?
Well, they have to estimate the average lifespan of 5,000 employees. They have to estimate what the investment returns will be over the next 40 years, returns which, can't be reliably guaranteed. And they have to estimate the impact of future taxes or levies, like those paid to the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, the PBGC, in the U.S., which insures these plans.
So the contribution required from the company is constantly uncertain because the calculations rely on assumption models that might change every single year.
Exactly. And this leads to an internal dynamic within the company known as the J-shaped accrual pattern.
The what?
The J-shaped accrual pattern. The present value cost of funding an employee's benefit grows very slowly early in their career, but it accelerates dramatically when they're in their 40s and 50s.
Why does it accelerate so late?
Because as the employee gets closer to retirement, the risk drops. The actuary knows their salary and tenure are somewhat locked in, and the time left for the company to fund the benefit is shrinking. Therefore, the funding obligation for the company costs significantly more for that older employee than it does for a younger entry-level one.
So the DB plan basically handcuffs the best workers to the company because their benefits are tied to long tenure. And the company finds it prohibitively expensive to hire older workers from competitors. That sounds like a drag on economic mobility.
It absolutely is. Furthermore, DB plans are inherently less portable. Moving jobs means you often lose the real value of that future-defined benefit, making the workforce stickier.
And a bit paternalistic.
Very. The company decided what was best. But many modern workers want control. So the move away from this open-ended, complex financial risk for the employer really paved the way for the alternative.
The era of the defined contribution plan?
In a defined contribution, or DC plan, the mechanism flips entirely. And the complexity transfers from the sponsor's balance sheet to the individual employee's desk.
Right.
The employer commits to a known specific proportion of earnings, the contribution that gets deposited into an investment account.
So the contribution is known. Let's say 3% employer match, 5% employee contribution. That's fixed. But the benefit is unknown until the day I retire.
That's the core difference. The retirement payment is simply whatever that account has accumulated in savings and earnings over time. And this defines the new risk allocation.
It's all on me.
All investment risk and reward is borne entirely by the individual employee.
Which means if the market tanks the year before I retire, my retirement savings plummet, and the company has zero obligation to make up the difference.
Correct. And let's not forget the longevity risk.
The risk of outliving your money.
The individual participant bears the risk of outliving their assets, With DB plans, the payment was generally for life. With DC plans, if you live to 105 and run out of money at 95, well, that's your problem.
But the portability of these plans must be exponentially better, right?
Vastly improved in practice. Legally, the rules might be similar, but administratively, it's night and day. If you leave a company, you simply roll over the existing account balance.
No actuary needed.
No actuary needed to calculate the present value of a future benefit. The liability is the account balance itself. It makes these funds highly mobile.
This is where employees supposedly gain control. They choose their funds, their stocks, their mutual funds, and they can often adjust their contribution amounts.
Yeah.
We see this with U.S. examples like IRAs and the ubiquitous 401k plans.
That control, however, is the double-edged sword. Advocates praise the flexibility and the ability to tailor investments. Critics argue, rightly, that many workers are ill-equipped to be Wall Street portfolio managers.
That's fair.
They lack the financial knowledge, they may panic and sell at market bottoms, or critically, they may not voluntarily contribute enough because they lack the discipline to prioritize a retirement that's 40 years away.
That's the behavioral side of the equation. We transition from a paternalistic system to one that requires, well, self-mastery and financial literacy.
And these accounts are heavily regulated, which adds another layer of administrative detail. For example, in the U.S., DC plans are subject to IRS rules and contribution limits, which are indexed for inflation. And while we don't need to recite specific figures, the indexing shows that the government is constantly trying to balance the amount of tax-advantaged savings versus overall tax collection.
And this DC model has become the global standard, moving far beyond the U.S.
Absolutely. The UK system includes personal pensions and the National Employment Savings Trust, or NEST. Germany has Rester plans. Australia runs the enormous mandatory superannuation system. New Zealand has KiwiSaver. It's the dominant model globally because it solves the corporate risk problem.
It's also worth distinguishing between the private DC funds and things like notional defined contributions, or NDCs, used in places like Sweden and Italy.
Oh, yes.
NDCs are government-run systems where your mandatory contributions are tracked as a notional account balance, but the money isn't actually invested in a real fund. It's still paid out on a pay-go basis.
Which is a beautiful example of how governments can adopt the appearance of DC, with the individual account tracking, while retaining the funding structure of pay-go, the intergenerational transfer.
Given the drawbacks of both the open-ended liability for the employer in DB and the crushing individual risk in DC, it's no surprise that the financial world has tried to invent something better.
Hybrid models.
Exactly, hybrid models.
A hybrid attempts to take the guaranteed safety of DB and combine it with the transparent account-based structure of DC. The classic U.S. hybrid is the cash balance plan, which got popular in the 1990s.
Explain how a cash balance plan works in practice, because it sounds contradictory. A guaranteed benefit, but expressed as an account balance.
It works by defining the benefit as if it were a savings account. So, for example, the plan promises to credit your account with 5% of your pay each year, plus a guaranteed 4% annual interest rate, regardless of how the actual investments perform.
Okay, so the risk is still technically with the employer.
Right. They have to ensure the actual investments meet that 4% guarantee.
Yeah.
But the communication to the employee is simple. You have an account balance of X.
That dramatically improves portability and transparency for the employee, while still forcing the employer to carry the investment risk. It's an interesting compromise.
But the real innovation, I think, is in risk-sharing schemes, which address that longevity risk inherent in pure DC plans.
Okay.
This is where members prove their contributions and consciously share both the investment risk and the longevity risk.
So I'm not just betting on my own life expectancy and my own portfolio. I'm pooling risk with thousands of other people who are also members of the fund. That sounds inherently more stable, especially against catastrophic market shocks.
Exactly. These are known as target benefit plans or collective defined contribution schemes, CDC schemes. If the investments perform poorly, the members might agree to reduce the future benefits slightly, but that hit is absorbed across the entire pool.
Instead of destroying a single individual's account just before retirement?
Exactly. And that communal stability has real-world backers. The outline cites some huge institutions running these models.
Who's doing this?
Major global players. Look at the State of Wisconsin Investment Board in the U.S., or TIAA, which manages investments for many universities. In the UK, the Royal Mail Pension Fund is a prominent example. And then in the Netherlands and Denmark, you have gigantic funds like Sticking Pension Funds, ABP, and Arbage Marketette's till expansion.
Okay.
These collective risk-sharing models were often mandatory and managed trillions of dollars. They really represent the cutting edge of managing longevity and investment risk effectively.
That discussion sets the stage perfectly for our next shift. We've looked at who takes the risk, the employer, the employee, or the collective. Now we shift focus to when the money is managed across generations.
Right.
We are moving from individual accounts to global generational financing models.
We're examining the dichotomy of funding, the pre-funded model based on savings and investment versus the pay-as-you-go model, which is based on immediate taxation and transfer.
Let's start with the one most familiar to listeners in the US, UK, or Canada, the funded or pre-funded approach.
In a funded plan, the contributions you make today are immediately invested in a massive pool of assets, stocks, bonds, real estate to grow and meet those future obligations. This is why common law jurisdictions like the US and UK require strong legal structures like pre-funded trusts. The law demands that trustees act solely for the beneficiaries to ensure the money is truly there in 30 years.
The numbers here truly illustrate the scale. The sources cite $50.7 trillion in global private pension assets back in 2019.
It's a staggering number.
With the U.S. holding a substantial portion of that. We are talking about the largest pool of investment capital on the planet.
And this contrasts sharply with many civil law jurisdictions like the Netherlands, Switzerland, and Japan, which also run highly funded systems, but often with stricter statutory requirements that lead to greater standardization and tighter regulatory control over the funds.
Now for the alternative, which operates on a completely different philosophical and economic principle, pay-as-you-go or pay-as-you-go.
Pay-go plans are, by definition, unfunded. There is no large invested reserve fund. Instead, current pension benefits being paid to retirees are paid directly and immediately out of the taxes and contributions collected from current workers.
So it relies entirely on a social and political contract, on intergenerational solidarity, and the assumption that future taxes and future generations will fulfill the obligations of the past.
It's dominant across much of Europe. Germany, France, Italy, Spain. They all rely heavily on the PGO model for their state pensions. The political commitment here is profound.
And interestingly, despite the lack of saved assets, these countries often rank well globally in terms of the net income replacement they provide to the average retiree.
They do. It's a huge paradox.
Why does a system without savings often provide better immediate results than a fully funded system?
Because the transfer is immediate, and it's guaranteed by the state's taxing authority. It's less exposed to the volatility of financial markets. But its stability relies entirely on favorable demographics, which, as we'll discuss later, is a rapidly failing condition across the developed world.
We should mention that national systems are rarely pure. Even highly pay-go systems often have partial funding components. Spain, for instance, has its Social Security Reserve Fund.
Right, and Canada's massive CPP, while essentially a PI-GO scheme, has a huge, actively managed CPP investment board. And even the U.S. Social Security system, while often described as PA-GO, invests its current surpluses in special U.S. Treasury bonds,
which provides a small measure of pre-funding, although critics argue those bonds are just internal government IOUs.
A fair criticism.
This complexity is why the World Bank created the multi-pillar system to standardize how we discuss the different functions of national retirement systems.
The multi-pillar framework is critical because it acknowledges that retirement provision needs to fill three separate functions: poverty alleviation, income redistribution, and saving insurance.
And relying on one mechanism to do all three is a recipe for disaster.
It really is.
Let's break down the functions, starting with the zero pillar.
The zero pillar is the baseline. Its sole objective is poverty alleviation among the elderly. It is entirely non-contributory, financed by general tax revenue.
That's a safety net.
A pure safety net. It takes the form of a flat basic pension or a means-tested benefit, ensuring no elderly citizen falls below the absolute poverty line.
This is the floor of the system, often seen in developing countries or as a supplemental benefit in developed nations. Moving up, the first pillar is the mandatory public system.
Its objective is broader: to prevent elderly poverty, replace some income, and provide a basic income based on social solidarity.
And this is usually where the PA-GO principle lives.
Historically, yes. It operates on a redistributive principle, often financed by mandatory contributions linked to earnings, the social insurance programs we see dominant in Western Europe. It enforces social solidarity through mandatory participation.
Next is the second pillar, which feels much more like a savings mechanism fulfilling the mandatory insurance function.
Correct. The second pillar aims to protect from relative poverty, providing significant supplementary income. This is typically mandatory, independently managed, and fully funded.
Like occupational schemes.
Exactly. It includes occupational schemes, be the DB or DC, and it is where those notional defined contribution systems in places like Sweden operate, providing a layer of forced saving above the state minimum.
Then we hit the third pillar, which is where personal choice and ambition kick in.
The third pillar is entirely voluntary. Its objective is pure consumption smoothing, the ability to maintain your pre-retirement lifestyle. This encompasses all the voluntary occupational schemes and private saving plans like IRAs,
Right.
where individuals can, with tax advantages, supplement their mandatory state and occupational coverage.
And finally, the fourth pillar, the invisible foundation that supports everything else.
The fourth pillar is fascinating because it doesn't involve formal, structured pensions. It covers informal support, the crucial role of family, often referred to as filial support. Other social programs like housing or national health care, and individual assets like homeownership and reverse mortgages. It acts as the critical, often unquantified safety net that determines a retiree's true security.
So we have dissected these complex five-pillar structures, DB, DC, funded, PAYGO. Yet, despite this institutional sophistication, many systems face a looming funding crisis.
A crisis driven by immovable demographic and economic realities. This is where the academic structure meets financial pain.
What exactly defines this so-called pensions time bomb or crisis? Is it simply running out of money?
It's the difficulty in paying corporate or government pensions because the long-term obligations far exceed the calculated resources. And the fundamental root cause is the dependency ratio.
The ratio of workers to retirees.
The ratio of workers, the contributors, to retirees, the beneficiaries. And that ratio is shifting dramatically due to two key demographic forces.
People are living longer and birth rates are dropping.
Exactly. Increased life expectancy means retirees draw benefits for much longer. Lower birth rates mean there are significantly fewer new workers entering the tax base to pay into the system. In many developed countries, the ratio is approaching 2 workers for every 1 retiree.
Which is a number that terrified actuaries a generation ago.
It's unsustainable. For the PA-GOA systems we discussed, Germany, France, this is an immediate catastrophe. If your entire system relies on intergenerational solidarity and the younger generation is half the size of the retired generation, the math just breaks down instantly.
It forces brutal economic choices.
Absolutely. Either the government allows public sector pensions to become an insurmountable economic drag, requiring massive debt, or it must drastically reduce benefits, or contributions must rise to punitive levels.
And let's not forget the corporate side. In the U.S., the problem is compounded by plan sponsors purposely underfunding their DB obligations. Why would a company or a state government actively choose to underfund its retirement promises?
It's a short-term economic calculation. They can defer today's cost into tomorrow's liability, effectively shifting the potential crisis onto federal insurers like the PBGC or onto future taxpayers.
It's a classic example of political short-termism meeting long-term liability.
It is.
We've also seen financial shocks accelerate this crisis.
Yeah.
Take the 2008 credit crunch. That wasn't a demographic problem, it was a sudden investment shortfall.
It was a painful moment of clarity. Major corporate pension plans collectively flipped from an $86 billion surplus at the end of 2007 to a staggering $217 billion deficit by the end of 2008.
That's a $300 billion swing in 12 months.
In a year. That demonstrates how highly leveraged and susceptible these systems are to investment market volatility.
And we also see subtle, ongoing economic pressures. Low interest rates, for instance, hurt the funded plans because their fixed income investments yield less, making it harder to meet future liabilities.
And the rise of the gig economy and high temporary unemployment, that exacerbates the PUI-GO problem. If more people are working intermittently or are classified as contractors, their contribution stream into mandatory state systems is either drastically reduced or non-existent.
It starves the system of necessary capital.
Exactly.
So we have a triple threat: demographic pressure, systematic underfunding, and acute financial shocks. This forces governments and plan sponsors to look at the 3 levers of painful reform.
When a system faces a deficit, there are only 3 primary adjustments possible. Every political debate you hear about pension reform involves pulling one or more of these levers.
Lever 1, increase contributions.
This is mathematically the simplest fix. Employees pay more, employers pay more, or both. The immediate painful drawback is that this reduces the net disposable income of the workforce, which can depress consumer spending.
And for employers,
It increases labor costs, making the economy less competitive on the global stage. It's a direct tax on labor and production.
Lever 2. Decrease real pensions. This is the one that sparks the most political outrage.
It is the most politically poisonous choice. This means reducing the actual payments promised to retirees. More commonly, governments choose to reduce the length of payments by increasing the statutory retirement age.
Often linking it automatically to increases in life expectancy.
Yes, we see this globally. Retirement ages are creeping up from 65 towards 67, 68, or even 70, simply because the actuarial necessity of stretching the fund requires fewer payout years.
And this choice creates intergenerational tension. The older generation feels their promised contract is being violated.
While the younger generation is told they have to work longer and pay more to cover the past debt.
And lever 3, the most fundamental, is systemic change aimed at actuarial fairness. This is about redesigning the mechanics themselves.
The goal of actuarial fairness is deep: to create a system where the total contributions, discounted back to today's value, equals the total expected benefits, also discounted today's value. It ensures that the system is self-balancing and intrinsically sustainable.
In simpler terms, you pay what you get.
Precisely. And this is vital, because pensions are fundamentally tools for redistributing risk and resources. They can redistribute wealth within a generation.
From high earners to low earners.
Or between generations, from young to old. But if the system is designed to be actuarially fair, it forces transparency about those underlying transfers.
If the numbers don't add up, you have to admit that either the young are subsidizing the old or the rich are subsidizing the poor. Actuarial fairness forces that conversation out into the open.
It raises the crucial question: should a retirement system be a savings plan or a tool for social redistribution? Finding the balance between those two is the ultimate challenge of pension reform.
Here is where we get to what I think is the most profound insight in our source material, especially concerning the crisis in PIGO systems. We talked about intergenerational solidarity, the contract where young workers fund their parents' retirement. When fertility rates tank, that contract is broken.
The decline in the total fertility rate, the TFR, is the demographic time bomb ticking under every PIGO structure. The system was designed for a high ratio of contributors to beneficiaries, but when that ratio shrinks, the system starves.
So the core solution proposed by some reformers is not just to fiddle with contributions or retirement ages, but to fundamentally shift the system to one that is intrinsically balanced, regardless of the TFR. They call this the human capital approach.
This approach is fascinating because it views children and the costs associated with raising them as a form of human capital investment that benefits the entire pension system.
It leverages the old age security hypothesis. What exactly is that?
It's the idea that in traditional societies, children served as the primary form of retirement security. The elderly care provided by the child generation was seen as offsetting the enormous cost and effort of raising that child. This hypothesis essentially monetizes that care and future contribution.
So how do you integrate that concept into a modern national pension system to balance the books?
You change the rules so that parental investment in human capital raising children is explicitly recognized as a contribution to the National Pension Fund. Wow. Certain models propose that the size of the pension contributions received by the parents should directly depend on the future pension contributions made by their children.
That's a radical structural shift. You are essentially recognizing that raising a future contributor is an economic service to the entire collective.
Exactly. It aligns incentives. If you recognize that a stable TFR is necessary for the collective good, the pension system can be redesigned to reward those who contribute to the TFR. It transforms the cost of child rearing from a private expense into a recognized contribution to the intergenerational transfer system.
Structurally balancing the system even as TFR fluctuates.
It is a highly sophisticated economic attempt to solve a profound social problem. It moves the conversation away from painful cuts and toward encouraging human capital investment. It's an intellectual leap forward in reform thinking.
Moving from the mechanics of the crisis, let's explore the human implications of these structures and briefly look back at how we arrived at this point.
Right. Starting with one of the most painful results of our current system design, the gender pension gap.
The persistent difference in average retirement income between men and women.
The data shows this isn't just a minor fluctuation, it's a systemic failure.
The variation across the OECD is shocking. The gap was only 3% in Estonia, but it ballooned to a stunning 47% in Japan, based on 2013-2018 data. What makes the gap so enormous in some nations?
The gap is a consequence of compound systemic inequality. It starts with the gender pay gap, but it is dramatically amplified by differences in employment rates, the disproportionate burden of parental leave, and the amount of unpaid care work performed by women.
I imagine the gap is smaller in Eastern European countries because their historical structures encouraged or even mandated continuous full-time female participation in the workforce.
That's precisely right. Fewer career interruptions mean less time outside the formal contributory system. The more a system relies on continuous contributions linked to full-time work, which describes almost all of these systems, the wider the gap becomes when one gender experiences significant career interruptions for caregiving.
And compounding this is the longevity issue, the years in retirement gap.
This is structural. According to 2024 OECD data, women are expected to spend 22.8 years in retirement, compared to 18.4 years for men.
4.5 more years.
So if a woman has accumulated less capital due to career breaks and a lower average salary, that smaller pot of money must then be stretched over 4.5 additional years.
That's a fundamental mathematical inequality built into the system that is only partially addressed by survivor benefits or spousal schemes. The gap is a clear indicator that our retirement systems are fundamentally optimized for a male, uninterrupted, single-career trajectory. It's easy to think of pensions as a modern invention, but the roots of this social contract go back centuries, starting with a very specific strategic need in ancient Rome.
We must begin with Augustus Caesar, who created one of the first truly functional pension schemes around the start of the Common Era.
His problem wasn't old age poverty.
No, it was military stability.
Hmm.
He needed a way to ensure the loyalty of his veteran legionnaires. He had just finished consolidating power, and a large army of unpaid, disgruntled veterans was a recipe for civil war.
So his solution was brilliant.
It was. After 16 years of service plus 4 years in reserves, a legionnaire received a massive lump sum pension, around 3,000 denarii, which is about 13 times the soldier's annual salary.
A huge incentive.
This was a critical component of statecraft, initially funded from general revenues, later through a dedicated military fund, the Arium Militare.
That shows the state viewing the pension not as charity, but as a strategic tool for managing social and political risk.
Moving forward, early modern efforts were much more segmented. We see small, specific efforts, often focusing on vulnerable groups that were essential to community function. In 17th century Germany, Duke Ernest, the Pious of Gotha, established widows' funds for clergy in 1645 and teachers in 1662. These were funded by small, yearly premiums, early examples of contributory insurance.
But the true foundation of the universal system we recognize today belongs to Germany in the late 19th century, with Otto von Bismarck.
Bismarck introduced the Old Age and Disability Insurance Bill in 1889. And this was not born of generosity, but of political pragmatism. Facing the rising tide of socialism and industrial discontent, he needed a way to integrate the working class into the state structure.
He essentially preempted the socialist movement by offering social welfare from the state, thereby securing political loyalty.
It was masterstroke. Germany became the first nation to introduce a universal mandatory program for employees. Initially, the retirement age was set at 70.
Which, given the life expectancy of the time, meant very few people actually collected.
Very few. But crucially, it established the mandatory, tax-financed PAYE-GO model that still dominates continental Europe.
The UK took a different path early on.
Yes. The UK's Old Age Pensions Act of 1908 offered a means-tested, non-contributory benefit of 5 shillings a week for those over 70. It was small, but it established the principle of state responsibility.
And after World War II?
The National Insurance Act of 1946 expanded this dramatically, creating universal coverage on a contributory basis. Fast forward to the modern era, the Pensions Act of 2008 introduced automatic enrollment in occupational schemes and created the public competitor, Nest, to encourage participation in the DC system.
And finally, the U.S. system started with informal promises to veterans, but truly scaled up in the private sector for an unexpected reason: World War II wage freezes.
That's right. During the war, companies were prohibited from raising wages to manage inflation. So to attract and retain talent, employers offered deferred compensation in the form of pensions instead. The defined benefit plan became the gold standard until the 1980s.
The bankruptcy filing of the Northern Mariana Islands Retirement Fund in 2012 is a grim, cautionary tale that connects the historical DB model to the modern crisis.
It does. It highlights how even public DB systems, once considered ironclad, can fail spectacularly if they allow benefits to swell without corresponding mandated funding increases.
Yeah.
The Mariana Islands had liabilities 3 times greater than its assets,
Wow.
demonstrating the ultimate danger of the open-ended promise model when political expediency trumps actuarial soundness.
We've covered vast ground today. We moved from the core definitions, established the critical distinction between defined benefit, the guaranteed promise, the sponsor's risk.
And defined contribution, the flexible investment, the individual's risk.
We then explored the global funding architecture, contrasting funded systems that rely on investment with pay-go models dependent on the social contract.
All framed within the World Bank's 5-pillar structure that separates saving, redistribution, and insurance.
And we confronted the harsh reality of the demographic crisis, the dependency ratio, which is forcing painful choices through the 3 levers of reform: increasing contributions, decrease in benefits,
Or implementing systemic changes like linking the pension system to the total fertility rate.
Understanding these structures is not just about balancing your checkbook. It's about recognizing the deep societal mechanisms that support or fail to support an aging world population.
So what does this all mean for you, the learner, navigating this future? We've seen that traditional state systems, particularly pay-go, rely entirely on intergenerational solidarity, the contract where the young care for the old.
But as lifespans increase dramatically and fertility rates remain critically low, that solidarity is under severe economic stress. And that strain is shifting financial risk back onto the individual and critically back onto the family structure.
Given this enormous shift in the dependency ratio and the stress on state resources, the informal 4th pillar family support is rapidly gaining importance.
Exactly. We know that the concept of filial responsibility, the legal or moral obligation of the child generation to care for the elderly generation, still exists in some laws globally, though it's rarely enforced today. The provocative thought for you to explore is this. As governments struggle to balance public debt against the societal contract of retirement, what happens when the state can no longer afford the 1st pillar? Will financial pressure force us to legally reinforce filial responsibility or otherwise formalize the role of family support, bringing the ancient Roman model of social obligation back into the modern financial contract?
Think about that tension between social obligation and financial liability.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us for the deep dive.